Imagine being absolutely certain that the world works one way and then discovering, without warning, that everything you were taught was incomplete. Not wrong in the way a lie is wrong, but wrong in the way a closed room is wrong when you suddenly realize there were windows all along. In the summer of 1943, thousands of German soldiers crossed the Atlantic believing they already understood America. They had been taught to picture it as a place of chaos and decay, a fractured society barely holding itself together, a nation driven by excess but hollow at its core, loud, inefficient, divided, and destined to collapse under the pressure of war. That belief was not accidental. It had been reinforced carefully, deliberately, for years. But belief systems are fragile things when exposed to reality, and reality was waiting on the other side of the ocean. The first shock wasn't violence. It wasn't hunger. It wasn't humiliation. It was normalcy. They expected shouting. They expected cruelty. They expected guards eager to punish defeated enemies. Instead, what they encountered felt disturbingly calm, efficient, almost indifferent to their presence. Ports functioning at full capacity, workers moving with practiced coordination, equipment everywhere. Noise, yes, but the noise of productivity, not panic. For men who had come from cities darkened by air raids, factories starved of raw materials, and rail lines collapsing under strain, this sight created a quiet confusion that none of them were prepared to name. Confusion is dangerous when you've been taught certainty. At first, they tried to explain it away. Appearances can be staged, prosperity can be faked, order can be temporary. But the longer they looked, the harder it became to maintain the story they had carried across the ocean. They were prisoners, yes, but they were also observers. And observation, when uninterrupted, has a way of eroding ideology. As they were transported inland, they saw a country that did not look like it was sacrificing everything to survive. Children played in neighborhoods untouched by rubble. Shops remained stocked. Trains ran not sporadically, but constantly. Long, uninterrupted chains of freight moving in both directions without pause. What unsettled them most was not the scale, it was the lack of strain. Nothing looked desperate. In Europe, war meant tension in every movement. It meant scarcity embedded into daily life. It meant watching systems buckle and patching them just enough to hold for another day. Here, systems did not appear to be holding, they were expanding. That realization arrived slowly, and then all at once. A single passing train loaded with equipment could be dismissed as coincidence. 10 could not. Hundreds could not. Factories visible from rail lines produced machines faster than many of these men had believed physically possible. Aircraft stood in rows, not as prized assets, but as inventory. Food was not guarded. Fuel was not hoarded. Electricity was not rationed in the way they understood rationing. For men trained to believe that discipline and willpower outweighed material advantage, this posed a silent question that none of them wanted to answer. What if discipline was not enough? What if willpower was not the deciding factor? What if the war was never a test of courage, but a test of capacity? That question did not arrive as a thought, it arrived as a feeling. A tightness in the chest when watching endless freight roll past. A moment of vertigo when realizing that destruction on the battlefield barely registered here. A growing sense that they were not fighting an opponent in decline, but an opponent only just beginning to apply its full weight. And still, the most disorienting part was not industrial strength, it was behavior. Guards did not act like conquerors. They acted like employees doing a job. They spoke casually. They followed procedures. They enforced rules without cruelty and without drama. No beatings, no public punishments, no performative hatred. That absence created an uncomfortable space because hatred had been expected, prepared for, mentally rehearsed. Without it, many of these men did not know where to place themselves. They were enemies, but they were not treated as monsters. They were captives, but not stripped of dignity in the way they had imagined captivity would work. This did not feel like mercy. It felt like confidence. And confidence, when observed from the losing side of history, is deeply unsettling. As days passed and camps came into view, expectations collapsed further. These were not improvised enclosures thrown together in haste. They were planned, electrified, organized, supplied. Lights worked, medical care existed. Food arrived in quantities that felt obscene compared to what many had known for years. Meals were not symbolic, they were abundant. For men whose families survived on reduced rations, watching guards eat the same food without ceremony was jarring. There was no performance in it, no announcement, no attempt to impress. It was simply how things were. And that fact alone caused cracks to widen. Because propaganda depends on contrast, it survives by exaggerating difference. But when reality refuses to perform that difference, propaganda begins to suffocate under its own weight. Numbers no longer felt abstract, they felt visible. Coal moved in quantities that made scarcity feel fictional. Oil flowed without desperation. Food was grown, transported, sold, eaten, and wasted in ways that contradicted everything these men had been told about capitalist decay. Waste, more than abundance, became the most disturbing symbol. To see food discarded casually, not in celebration, not in excess, but in routine, struck deeper than any statistic ever could. It suggested something far worse than enemy strength. It suggested permanence. This was not a nation burning itself to win a war.
This was a nation capable of fighting while remaining itself. And that realization created a silent reckoning that no interrogation could have forced. Men began to reassess not just the war, but the assumptions that led them into it. They had believed they were part of a historic correction, a disciplined force destined to reorder a broken world. They had been taught that sacrifice separated the strong from the weak. But here was a society that appeared strong without demanding constant sacrifice from its people. That contradiction did not announce itself loudly. It worked slowly, through conversations with civilians who did not flinch, through children who waved without fear, through farmers who offered food without resentment. Each interaction chipped away at the idea of inevitable conflict. And something else began to happen, something far more dangerous to rigid belief systems. These men began to imagine alternatives, not in grand political terms, not in speeches or manifestos, but in quiet, personal ways. What if life did not require constant struggle? What if strength could coexist with comfort? What if order did not require fear? Those thoughts were never spoken aloud at first. They were too heavy, too disloyal to voice. But once they appeared, they did not leave. And by the time many of these prisoners realized what was happening, the shift was already irreversible. They were no longer simply waiting to go home. They were watching a different future unfold in front of them, one that made the ruins waiting across the ocean feel suddenly unbearably final. And this was only the beginning, because the longer they stayed, the more the quiet contradictions multiplied, and the deeper the question became, not who will win this war, but what kind of world will remain when it ends. One that shows what happens when power outgrows politics, when technology evolves faster than ethics, and when imagination finally escapes fiction. And this is only the beginning, because once the world accepts that such a ship can exist in real life, the next question won't be if more will follow, it will be who gets left behind.